Again, I'd like to welcome you all to the Jean Monnet Center Montreal Winter 2021 Speaker Series. I'm Juliette Johnson, Professor of Political Science at McGill and a member of the Center, and I'm moderating our series this term, which focuses on Europe and memory. So we'll start with our speaker presentation, which will last about 40, 45 minutes. We're loose. And then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Just want to remind everybody that the talk itself will be recorded, but the Q&A will not be. And then we'll go until 10:25 in the morning. So I'm thrilled today to have with us Dr. Mame Fatou-Niang, who is an associate professor of French and Francophone studies at Carnegie Mellon University. She's the author of Identité Française, published by Brill in 2019, and also a fabulous co-directed documentary, Mariannes Noires, Mosaïque Afropéenne, which is a film in which 7 Afro-French women investigate the pieces of their mosaic identities and unravel what it means to be Black and French and Black in France. And she's currently working on a second manuscript on Blackness in 21st century France. So, Dr. Niang, we're thrilled to have you with us today, and the floor is yours.
Oh my God, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Yes. So really, thank you so much. I really wanted to thank you, Dr. Jones, for extending this invitation, and thank all of you for attending the talk and for taking the time to engage with some of my material. So I imagine this talk as, kind of a series of reflection from the perspective of an Afro-French scholar artist. And we'll see that, I hope we'll get a chance to talk about that, but that denomination, the fact that I call myself an Afro-French is something that's, that sometimes gets me into some trouble in France. The fact that I am presenting myself with this hyphenated identity in a country-wide identity. Our constitution says that la francité est une et indivisible. Identity is supposed to be, Frenchness. It's this unique thing, and to hyphenate it with, an ethnic or racial marker gets me into a lot of trouble. We'll get to talk about that. So for the past 15 years now, I've been studying, researching race and its absence / presence in France, and I've been very quite busy. But really, in the past 5 years, and definitely since the murder of George Floyd, this past spring, the gates have swung open on these debates. And at times, for the past 9 months, it's been hard to bookmark and keep an eye on the constant development, right? On the French public scene, how we went from almost nothing to just this onslaught of conversation and debates and new laws, from the anti-racist demonstration with hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of Paris, Montpellier, Marseille, to the recent attacks on academic freedoms coming from, the French state, to the condemnation of critical race studies or critical studies of, racial discrimination, to just all kind of really stunning developments and laws against minorities in the name of the values of the Republic. So my hope in the next 40 minutes or so is to organize this mass of information, this onslaught of information, and give you a snippet of the situation in France right now regarding the articulation of race, citizenship, and identity in the public sphere. How do we talk about race in a country that struggles to see it, in a country that pretends that race doesn't exist? How do we navigate in a field, I'm talking about just my research, a scientific field that is marred by invisibility and the lack of words to anchor our field? I mean, for example, there is no word in French for Blackness, right? How did the 2020, what I call the 2020 racial spring, affect the field, and what's next? So I'm currently working on the notion of universalism as it's understood, packaged, and transmitted in France, and reflecting on French identity, on its many components, on its history, and because it's also my field, looking at the place that race place in this articulation, and the articulation of a set of questions such as who is French? How was our national memory constructed? What is the impact of this historical shaping of our national narrative, what I call the roman national, on very contemporary process of integration or exclusion from the national community? How do we acquire, process, and spread the words that say inclusion or exclusion out of from the national community? And here I want to go back to my film Mariannes Noires, and to that moment where Afro-French filmmaker Alice Job talks about that episode that she had. She's a woman of words. She's a filmmaker. She plays with words. Words are her life. And then all of a sudden she found herself stuck with, this case of aphasia. And it's happening at the same time that Sarkozy is having this extremely, there's this very brutal assault on minorities, and it translates by words. The impoverishment of words, right? And then on the public sphere, but also just this assault 24/7, in the radio, on newspapers. And faced with that, she's just stuck, and she loses the capacity to speak French, the ability to speak French, and she will regain it by reading, Montesquieu, Voltaire, etc. That was it was very tragic, but also I found it very, French, that she regains her Frenchness by reading all these, classic authors. And for me, when I think about this place, just thinking about the way she chronicles her struggle with language, that testimony, that part really powerfully highlights the place that words, the place that speech, and the ways in which the distribution of words, of speech, of what is visible, what is not visible, what is written, what is not written, how that affects bodies like hers, bodies like mine, gendered, racialized bodies that are situated in the periphery of our national imaginary. And to me, that very powerful speech that she had, Alice's words really brought out many interrogations, like who can talk, who has access to words, to say what, about who, how, what impact do these words have on others? How do we heal the wounds inflicted by too many words or by a lack of words? So I live in a country, I'm from a country that look at itself, that sees itself as one and indivisible, a country that sees itself, and that is often also perceived from the outside as being culturally homogenous. I'm from a country that is officially blind to color, blind to race, but race is coded everywhere. I give you an example. Last week, I attended a roundtable at the Museum of National Immigration, and a very important, researcher, French researcher, working at a very important American university and well-respected from the left, looked at me and said, you should not just blindly import American paradigms on race to France. This is France, and we don't have the same multicultural history than America. And do you know what, young lady? I too am. I mean, he was a white man, a French white man, and he told me, I too am a son of immigrants. I'm like you. Then I looked at him and I say, no, we're not. You're not like me. My family has been living in the mainland, in mainland France since 1835. I am not a daughter of immigrants. I'm a 7th-generation French person. But what allowed him to look at me, even though he was trying to create, proximity between the two of us, what allowed him to just look at me and just imagine that I will be the daughter of immigrants? After 7th generation, why am I still considered an immigrant? What is it about me that screams not French? How many generations does it take to be considered a French person? And I don't think that ever in his life he's ever been asked if he was the son of daughter or if he was the son of immigrant. So there's something that is coded in the way we think of ourselves. There's something that is coded in the way of we think who is French, who is naturally born French, who can acquire Frenchness through culture and who cannot. And that is coded everywhere in a country that pretend that it's not multicultural. That code is in public debates around the banlieue, where words as the banlieue, the ghettos, or words as jeune, when you hear the word jeune today in the newspapers or in the news, in the youngsters, it's a code for Black and Maghrebi. In debates around Islams, the word Muslim have become code for Arab, Algerian, and more recently Turkish. I am Muslim, but people just don't read Blackness as being, equated to with Islam. So Islam is today code for Arab or Algerian, in reference to the trauma of the Algerian War for the French Republic. Even debates around the emancipation of women's body, and I'm thinking here about the recent conversation at the French, the Assemblée Nationale around certificate of virginity, or the 30-year-old debate on the veil, or the urban planning, right? That should allow women to occupy more public spaces, or public spaces traditionally dominated by men. All of this public conversation around, issues that sounds as banal as urban planning are encoded to target Black and Arab males without ever saying the word noir, Black, or the word Arab. So these codes and silence around the racial question haunt our daily lives. And they've been naturalized in the media, in our schooling system, in the way we think of ourselves, in the way we write our history, in the art world, in academic research, and in our language. We have one of the most developed, beautiful, I'm sorry, I'm being very chauvin, but I'm French, right? I can say that, language. We have words for everything, and we don't have words to qualify me. I mean, there is no word for Blackness, right? So these elements, I think, are embedded in France's attitude on and with race, or with difference, or with its imperial history, and they've profoundly shaped the country's self-image, as well as the representation of us, nous, and eux, them. Who's in, who's out, who can be seen as naturally in, and who is naturally out, who is French, and who's an alien other. And what I do with my work, whether, with my research, the scientific research, but also my art, the films, the photo, is to try to stress the urgency in knocking down those silences and filling up what I see as harmful voids. And on the question of voids and amnesia, for example, I think of the discursive construction of colonization and slavery as a foreign institution, mainly an American institution. And for example, in my interventions in France, whether in universities or public intervention, I often invite my French audiences, and it really clicked in people's mind. I often, ask people to reflect on our imaginary around slavery, the way we think of slavery. As French people, why is it easier for us to associate slavery with cotton in Alabama, with the whip in Louisiana, the nice plantations in Louisiana, than with sugarcane in Guadeloupe? Why is it that we've learned in school about Jim Crow, and we've learned about the civil rights movement, and we've learned about the horrors of segregation in America, in the United States? I've lost count of how many schools and parks are named after Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks. But how many school children have ever heard of Mulâtre et Solitude, of Toussaint Louverture? How many French people know that actually Haiti was a French colony? So to me, these erasures feels a special brand of racism that is not recognized, not just ordinary, but very active racism that is not recognized by the same people who deploy it, because of the very French interpretation of the word racism, which is an abomination that is relegated to foreign land. We can recognize racism in Bolsonaro's Brazil. I was part of a commission invited by Brazilian colleagues who wanted to, pushed La Mairie de Paris to have a park named after Marielle Franco. And it happened in 2 weeks. A park was named after Marielle Franco because, Brazil is really bad with indigenous and Black people. We recognize racism as it's deployed in apartheid South Africa. We recognize racism as it's been historically deployed in the United States and as it's being deployed now. But we have issues seeing it happen in France, the lens of enlightenment, the cradle of human rights. And I think it has a lot to do with that's what I'm working on right now on my new book, this confusion on what I call les auxiliaires, la confusion des auxiliaires. We should not, use the auxiliary be with racism. We should use the auxiliary have, because unless, you are from the KKK or from the Front National, nobody wants to call themselves to say, I am racist. But the thing is, we all have racism. And in the case of France, our having racism is something that's actually, it's not that I want to take any culpability from people, but we're coming from a system that has been extremely successful at sewing it into us. Just thinking, for example, of the institution of school. And I'm currently finishing a chapter of the book that is entitled The Three Graces of French Racism: innocence, ignorance, and arrogance. And in this chapter, I analyzed three common stances towards anti-racism in France, in the French context of memory, identity, and citizenship. And I define innocence as the childish state in which France keeps its citizen through, for example, the Éducation nationale, the way we don't learn about colonization, the way we don't learn about slavery, the way, my family originates from Senegal, came from Senegal at the beginning of the 19th century, but people still ask me why I speak such a good French, which even if I had come from Senegal, 10 years ago, would have been strange, given that Senegal had been a French colony since 1659. How can you ignore that, right? So this innocence I define it as the childish state in which we kept through the Éducation nationale, this very, organized program for schooling that kind of removed this, following what Renan said, when he said that one of the biggest danger to national unity was the development of history, and that forgetting, actually amnesia, was sometimes needed, because unity was never achieved through, just joy, sometimes sacrifice, sometimes people had to lose. And we have to make sure how we put together, how we write this national narrative. And sometimes we have to forget things, we have to, or we clearly just have to use amnesia. And in my case, when you think of how identity is constructed in France, to be French is not true blood, it's not true religion. Our glue is the fact that we are a group, and this group is created through the idea of having done great things together in the past. And from that, we have a sense of who we are today and how we want to invite other people to join us today. And from there, we take the energy. It gives us the energy to spring towards a better future. But when people look at me and I'm not in the rear view, they have no idea how I got here. They have no idea how I contributed to what we have now, how they can see me as part of the national group. And in that sense, schooling and our national program, for me, it's really one of the first line of battle. Language, how we can decolonize our language to include this notion, not of difference, because it's not difference to France. It's part of French history, but also, just include. And I find it very interesting when my detractors tell me, oh, you want to rewrite French history, or you want to amputate French history. I'm like, oh my God, it's the contrary. I'm trying to expand the scope, right? So take people out of this innocence. And so this innocence is fed through a school, the cultural institutions, the type of lights that they put on our history, the type of lights they put on our identity, and just a plethora of institutions that are aimed at reinforcing the narrative of Frenchness as a singular item that cannot be hyphenated, a singular item that cannot be racialized, but that is coded as white, but that doesn't say its name. And maybe in the Q&A, we can discuss about that, how that really came for me, that really came into light with the wave of hate that I received when my movie came out, and it was called Mariannes Noires, and people actually went crazy because Marianne cannot be Black, because Marianne doesn't have a color. We'll talk about that later. Ignorance, I define as the willful process of maintaining the innocence once the Republican myth is challenged. And I see the third grace, arrogance, as a remnant of the civilizing mission, the reaction that unfolds in like myriads of attitude ranging from flat out denial of racism can't exist in France, to the reversing of stigma and claims of a country that is, or French model that is under mortal siege. And I see it a lot in the kind of knee-jerk reaction that people have when I just tell them to keep quiet and listen, right? To listen not to necessarily what is being said, but what is left out, who is left out, what is forgotten, why, when, and what do these silences say about power and inequality of power, right? Learning how to listen to silence, because people, I'm always extremely worried when I hear people say, "Oh, I want to give a voice to voiceless." There's no such thing as a voiceless person. It's just that people don't know how to listen, right? Even the silences can be, encoded, decoded to produce histories that had been, traditionally marginalized. So I'm looking at how these three postures came together, for example, in defense of the Assemblée Nationale fresco, and I'll show you, I'll at the end of the talk, I'll walk you through this, of the Assemblée Nationale fresco, and how when so this fresco that was ordered by the French state in 1991 to commemorate the abolition of slavery, and it's the most racist thing you could ever see. It's a blackface, and when my colleague and I, Julien Sudo, pointed at it being blatantly racist, people told us, you know what, we never learned in school. I mean, we had a French minister of culture, we had critics of arts telling us, we never learned in school that these signs were harmful or racist, and as long as the institution don't tell us such, that we're not told that they're racist, we won't see them as such. That was it. And for me at this point, everything came together, the not having been told or taught about these signs, and what I thought at the time were flaws of our educational system, but then I realized that actually no, this was a sign of how successful our Republican ecosystem was at erasing these signs from our collective memory, right? That's the innocence. But then once Julien and I pointed and challenged the innocence and the ignorance, then the arrogance came full blown, and we were just victim of a 2 weeks complete blitz attack from the French media, from this just complete panel from the left to the right, politicians calling us, like agent of the United States, trying to bring an American model of society to France, and we were called all kind of names. So I will talk more about the fresco and about what it says, on the state of race relation and the state of the country, the relation of the country to memory. But I want first to talk about an element of my research that's also related to the search that will help you understand the difficult balancing act, right, that we are facing in France in the way we want to handle the race question. And the element is the recent, and that's funny when people call it the recent explosion in conversation around blackface in France, right? And to talk about it, I will show you some pictures about La Nuit des Noirs. And I don't know why, but my PowerPoint is frozen, but don't worry, I will make sure that you'll get these images. So for the past 50 years in the northern city of Dunkirk, there's been a festival called La Nuit des Noirs. I will show you pictures. And you basically have 10,000 people running in the streets for 2 weeks. And they're parading through the streets in costumes and, black makeup to resemble African tribal figures and cannibals. And I'll show you the picture. It shows, I think it's 2 or 3 men in blackface, sporting bright, huge red lips, featherhead dresses, bones in the nose and everything. And for the past 50 years, it's been happening. And for 6 years ago, some Afro-French researchers and residents of the city started, sounding the alarm. This is not something that's happening, it's not a group of 10 people, it's 10,000 people running in the streets for, weeks. And the backlash was It was insane, absolutely insane. The mayor of the city, who's a left winger, came in defense of the event and invoked, of course, freedom of expression and what we call l'esprit de Charlie Hebdo, right? He defended as, I'll read it here, freedom of expression, and that he said that what they were doing was the essence of the Republic, liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberté, because for 2 to 3 weeks, everybody was free. Everybody was free to roam the streets. Égalité, because under the mask and under the blackface, we didn't know who was rich, who was poor, who was the worker, who was the boss. And fraternité, because at the end, one of the main aim of the festival was to, raise fund for families of mariners who had disappeared at sea, right? So I found it absolutely amazing that he is defending this obviously racist initiative as being something that is the true definition of the Republic, liberté, égalité, fraternité, but also the true definition of what l'esprit de Charlie was in the wake of the terrific terrorist attack of the 2015. And then in the wake of that event in 2019, so the festival's been going on for 50 years, nobody ever complained. And then starting in 2015, Afro-French people started complaining, but nobody heard them. And it's really in 2019 that it blew up. And it blew up in the French media. People started explaining it, and it's happening at the same time that we have a play that used the blackface at the Sorbonne that was prevented by a group of activists, and that became the huge talk in France, right? The dictatorship of minority. And what I found also very interesting was that in the media, people started introducing. There was a lot of pedagogy first in explaining to French readers, in the newspapers or French viewers on what blackface was. And the way it was explained was that blackface was an American institution tied to Jim Crow America that was very racist. But oh, wait, once it crosses the Atlantic and land in mainland France, it's just fun. It's liberté, égalité, fraternité. And that to me, was very striking, how it's recognized as harmful, absolutely harmful when it's done in the US or in Canada by a certain prime minister, but it doesn't register in France. Not only it doesn't register as negative, but it's sanitized and becomes actually an emblem of the République. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberté d'expression, and Charlie, right? So that brings me to just try to realize how did we got to forget that not only blackface didn't change, but blackface had a French history, right? So that's what I'm trying to, look now. What is the difference between, Carnival as it was, done in France in the 17th, 18th century, and instances of blackface that I've been able to encounter in the 18th and the 19th century, and that had nothing to do with Carnival. This was blackface. And now I'm really pushing people to use the word barbouillage, because we know how language is important. By using the word blackface, we're stressing its foreign origin, its foreign identity. And we know in the case of France, how important language is to indigenize something, how important the role that French language played in creating national identity. And by keep calling something by its, foreign name, we refuse to own it. So I'm calling it barbouillage, and it's not a term that I invented. I found it in a letter from 1539. So there is a French art of barbouillage. So to me, exposing this, this amnesia, exposing these French roots became, very apparent. When I walked to the Assemblée Nationale, I was actually invited to screen my film, and right next to the door of the movie theater at the French National Assembly, I saw that fresco. It was 12 feet large, 5 foot long, and it was the most racist thing I've ever seen. I could not believe my eyes. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then my surprise was actually compounded when I realized that this fresco was actually ordered by the French state to commemorate the first abolition of slavery in 1794, because we had two abolitions. I mean, slavery was abolished and reinstated. So it was just a shock. How can this be created? I mean, I'm an artist. Anything can be created, but how can this be in the French National Assembly? And how can it be here to commemorate the abolition of slavery, given the patchy relation that we have with remembering our own involvement in this institution, that you can literally count on the fingers of one hand how many monuments we have dedicated to slavery in France. We have one in the House of the People, and it's this thing, and it's been there for 28 years. So it was just all this question that made me start, a petition with, it was a letter that we sent to the President of the National Assembly, telling him that this was humiliating, this was dehumanizing, it was an insult, not just to the millions of people who died, who were victims of slavery and to their descendants, but it was an insult to France. This could not be the way, this could not be the contribution of France to the way we were memorializing institution. So it was met with a quasi-unanimous chorus, absolutely quasi-unanimous chorus in the French press and in the political world, and everybody converged to defend the artist, his past engagement of work, that how at 6 years old he bought, rice to send to little kids dying of hunger in Ethiopia, that the work could not be racist because it was aimed at commemorating the abolition of slavery. How can anything, with such a good intention be racist? It was in, we were told that it was in a Republican rampart, right? The Republic and its institution were like kryptonite for racism. So anything that's racist could not penetrate the wall of the National Assembly. We were told that we were ignorant, that we were incapable of seeing the piece for what it was, a fun attempt at caricature and a piece of irony in the purest French tradition. And that further stressed Julien, who, by the way, is French, and I, alienation from French tradition. We were told that we were ayatollahs issuing a fatwa against the artist. And people cited Voltaire, Charlie Hebdo, the freedom of, sacredness of art, and, to tell us that it was art and it was free to shock. And to us, really, the point had never been to really accuse the artist of being racist, but it was not even about him. And this is really why I think that the conversation got lost, because it becomes something about the people, the artist, me and Julien. And in this brouhaha, nobody looked at the piece. And it's not, who am I? I mean, I'm an artist. Who am I to ask for an art piece to be destroyed? We will not, I don't want it to be destroyed. I want it to sit in a place where people, the next generation, will look at it and think about how this came, for 30 years to represent one of the only 3 monuments for slavery in mainland France. How did it happen? I never say that the artist was racist. I say that he had racism, and he had reasons to have racism, because for him to, at 65 years old, look at us straight in the eyes and say that he doesn't see what's wrong in the piece, something had to be done. We need some type of intervention. And the intervention was not just on him, it was on us as a people. How could people could not see that this was wrong? Right. So yeah, we raised the petition to denounce what we call the blind angles of French culture that allowed such a work anchored in racist imaginary to be created, to be hanged on these sacred walls, right, for 3 decades, and for the furor that engulfed, our initiative once we raised that issue. And in my opinion, they are 2 elements that are absolutely essential to understand what is at play here, right? In this relation between French society and its hyper-visible minorities, that hyper-visible components that the majority pretends that it doesn't see, right? And to me, those 2 elements are the idea of anchoring and the notion of the imaginary. And I'm very struck by the way in which the theme of importation, every time, I mean, when we raise the issue of the fresco, oh, you importing American vision, the blackface, you are importing American vision. I have dreadlocks, I can't be French, I'm importing an American hairstyle. I mean, this is like literally the way, my hair comes out of my head, but I'm importing. And I'm very struck by the way this issue of importation and of, something being étranger is weaponized, especially at the moment, in order to avoid anchoring these issues in a Franco-French soil, as if it was impossible for us to we like to have this, I don't know the word in English, long view, this telescope fixed in the garden, the messy garden of, dysfunctional America, or the messy garden of dysfunctional Brazil, but we don't realize that actually we have to turn it on us and, like a mirror, and look in it and realize that these discussions, they also relate to us, they also relate to the House France. And the fact that now, I mean, when you open the French news, what do you see? Woke, cancel culture, all these words that are, that are foreign, that are constantly changing definitions, that have become, like catchphrases, that empty signifiers used by people who sometimes won't even know how to define them, but words that occupy a very important space at the expense of indigenous issues, right? I'll give you quickly an example. For example, 10 years ago, we had one of the most famous actors in France, Olivier Torreton, had to be blackface to play Othello. The same treatment was applied to Gérard Depardieu, so he could play mixed race Alexandre Dumas. And when that was raised, of course, I mean, it was this huge earthquake. Ooh, you're importing American race. This is a great artist. There's no issue of race. I mean, no issue of race in Othello. Did these people read Othello, right? And to me, we all, by focusing on the importation, by focusing on, we don't see race, we just see two great artists on stage, we miss opportunities to question, for example, really intense French. I'm thinking of the place of Black actors in French theater, right? How in 2010 or 2020, why do we have to blackface a white actor to play a Black character when Black actors are being told auditions after auditions that there's no role for them because the 2 thieves and 1 terrorist role have already been distributed and there's no role for them? And instead we got lost into, these epic battles over the importation of American political correctness, the dictatorship of minorities, all in order to avoid that these conversations are about us and the way we deal with what we don't want to deal with, right? And so for me, all of this, and I'll finish with this, raise many questions. How can one talk about oneself, right? Where do one look for oneself when one is not part of the imagination that the group construct of itself? When one's presence in the group is marked either by invisibility or by hypervisibility in very problematic categories, when one is absent from the national narrative or from the definition of its literary or cinematographic canon, right? And to me, my commitment to these questions in my research and to of my colleagues also working on the question is attracting right now much criticism. And there's been a very wicked and nasty explosions of debates, explosion on the debates around these questions in France, and the dangerous drift of French social sciences plagued by racialism, plagued by the hatred of the Republic, plagued by the hatred of whiteness, right? And of course, the importation of American tropes. And to me, this attack, they speak of the difficulty, again, to accept that my colleagues and I were unveiling, that which shall remain unspoken, that we're highlighting elements whose invisibility has been naturalized. And what I do as a researcher on race and citizenship in France is try to shed lights on naturalization process, to show the origins of the discourse that we are fed, to show that there's nothing natural, but we're engaging with processes that have been well taught, processes that create identity on one hand and marginalization on the other, that create an us on one hand and a them. And I try to provide alternative if possible. And I often come back to what Michel Rolf Trouillot this definition of the unthinkable, right? This difficulty for France to come to terms with history, not as it wanted it not as they wanted it to have happened, but with how it actually happened, right? For example, the impossibility for us to think around the Haitian Revolution. And this is what we have to push against, the discourse around we are past racism and race, we are universal, we had this universal magic pill and it places 200 light years ahead of the USA, of Canada. No, it's not. We really have to look at ourselves in the mirror and see what these conversations say, about us. And in my research, I'm trying to give people two alternatives. Either we think that we are good where we are and we embalm our ideals and set them in stone, or we envision our group's trajectory, as something that is a contract that is in constant negotiation, a work in progress, a co-production that is post-colonial, necessary post-colonial, and that is constantly, molded to and refined to meet our current challenges in France. And for me, it's this latter model that I'm trying to unveil, something that is fluid, something that is dynamic, a project that is never completed, but something that is constantly reinvented, and that a true universalism that should be a call for project in order to find new creators of the us, of a real Respublica, right, of a true public thing. And so that's where we are. That's really the essential question, the crux of my research. What does this refusal to recognize the paternity, the French hand in the origins of the postcolonial say? How can we take part in the conception of a child and refuse to recognize them as your own? What does this denial say about us? Who is us, right? Who are we? And what does this debate, what do these debates say about the production of knowledge? What can be considered as knowledge? Who can be considered as legitimate producer of knowledge? The production of imaginaries, right? About the circulation of knowledge and imaginaries. And to me, these are exciting tracks that force us to raise the debate and to project ourselves into, exciting futures, however grim the current debates might be. Voila.